Welcome to the overview for Lab 10, creating a schedule integration loading data into Oracle ERP Cloud. Now this is, as you can see, a very long lab exercise with a lot of different steps. We've kind of divided it into 6 different practices, 10-1 through 10-6. But some of these practices are actually pretty long themselves, and so we have subdivided them into parts. So please take your time as you watch and then work through this. The use case is pretty straightforward. We're focusing on leveraging the import bulk data services for ERP Cloud that leverages these FBDI compliant files. We talked about these in the lectures. An example would be journal entries, for example. So the high level concept here is to stage a source file in an FTP server or some location that can be retrieved by an integration flow. That integration flow takes it, does any enrichment, transformations, or whatever needs to be done, and then take that file that's been transformed and initiate an import into ERP Cloud. Now, later, after ERP Cloud has done a load and import, it's capable of sending a callback if we register a callback integration. That would be flow number 2. Now, we're not going to do the second part of that just from a sake of time perspective. So that full end-to-end would involve flow 2. We're going to focus in on flow 1, which is the bulk of the work, and we simply won't define a callback. So there's a whole lot of steps and tasks separated into a whole lot of different sections. We're going to be creating yet another connection to another SaaS application, Oracle ERP Cloud, of course, and then leverage a lot of other connections we already have available, the FTP server, for example, and then introduce ourselves to some new actions we perhaps have not used yet, like a for each loop. Leveraging additional stage file actions. This will not be a solution that you import. This is a full end-to-end implementation. Again, the high-level scenario for us is to focus on retrieving and unzipping the file that comes from the FTP server that you're going to stage with your FTP client. We'll transform these comma delimited data files. Then we'll aggregate them back after they've been transformed into another zip archive, which will then be uploaded to the journal entries bulk upload job. In order to do this one, you have to have completed, of course, in addition to practice Lab 1, Lab 9. Now, technically, you don't have to successfully complete Lab 9 for this to work, but you must have implemented all of 9.1 and 9.2 because that involves the external FTP server. Okay, that's our high-level overview for Lab 10. We have several practices to go, so we'll see you in the next video. All right, starting with practice 10-1, we'll go ahead and make that connection to Oracle ERP Cloud. So follow with me as we go through the steps. Before I release this, let's quickly review where I'm getting this information from. Again, on the Lab tab, as we did with the other SaaS applications, we're looking for the URL, and in this case, the credentials are for Oracle ERP Cloud, which will be the FAS, something similar to what you would see perhaps in your Lab tab as well. So let's get to it here. I will, now that I have those credentials, move to step 2. We're opening the console, moving over into our project, and going to create a new connection. We'll search for ERP, and we want Oracle ERP Cloud. The name of this connection is going to simply be Oracle ERP. And we're going to use, once again, both the trigger and invoke role. Although, again, in this particular lab, we're only going to be using the invoke role for a connection configuration. Click Create, which takes us to that ERP Cloud host. So as we did with the other Fusion applications, we grab that URL and paste it in. And Again, as with other Fusion apps, there are other security policies, but for sake of simplicity and for this lab, we're choosing the username password token policy, where I'll paste in the username and paste in the password, double checking that I haven't made any mistakes. So clicking on test. As always, this will likely take a little bit of extra time, so be patient. All right, we have our confirmation banner that it's tested, and now it's time to save it. Same thing here, Graham. Saving can take up to a minute. And there is the save confirmation banner. And we can see it's in the configured state. So we click the go back arrow to go to the project homepage, and we can see our configured new connection. That's it for this practice. See you in the next video. All right, here we go in practice 10-2, where we're going to be now creating this new schedule integration, and we'll also stage the file we need in our FTP server that we'll be using later on for testing. So follow along with me as I begin with task number 1. We are going to click plus to add a new integration, select the create option, and this time the schedule pattern. And the name we've been asked to use is import journal entries. I'll paste that in there and we click create. And similar to when we use an application pattern, it pops up to ask us, well, what do you want to invoke next? We are not going to invoke anything right now. What we want to do instead, for purposes of this exercise, is to set up a couple schedule parameters. So you can either double click this or click here to edit, either way. That opens up this configure schedule parameters pane, where we're going to add a couple of them. The lab instructions say that call one of them FTP download directory, FTP download dir, and for our case, we want to put in the value of the location on the FTP server where our folder is. And so let's revisit that. You should have already done this from the previous lab exercise. In fact, while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and delete those two files. We don't need them anymore. But I am going to make note I'm going to make note of this directory. Hang on, it needed to reconnect to the server. We timed out. Let me try that again. I know exactly what I did. I had reconnected to the VPN and forgot that it won't work while you're on the VPN. This is a good reminder for you too. If you run into a problem, double check. If you're on the VPN, your connection to the FTP server obviously will not work, not without doing some extra settings. All right, so then now that that's disconnected, I can see my connection is successful, and we should be able to execute these deletes. Sure. So my main point here is I need that directory location. I'll paste that in here, and we'll change that to be our default value. So now I don't have to set it or change it when we do a run. The next thing we want to add is an email address. I'm sorry, we're adding the file to download. And so rather than hard coding the value for this, we are going to initially create the name of the file that we wish to have. Our lab instructions say call it journalentries.zip, and we have that file for you. Truth be told, we're not going to change that, but in the real world, you'd have an opportunity to, when you made another schedule run, you could change the name of the file that you're looking to download. So that's been added, and we need to do one more, and that is set up an email address for those email notifications. So we're going to call this email2. And once again, you're going to put in your email address. I'm putting in mine so that I can show you the emails that I receive, and we have those values brought in. So we click over here to close the pane. It's synchronizing and updating the values, and now I click Save to save the integration so far. Next thing we want to do is go ahead back into FileZilla, and to prepare for running and testing this particular integration once we finish with it will be this journalentries.zip file that we alluded to, and there it is in our resources folder. I'm just going to park that and stage that here in that FTP directory. All right, so that'll be ready for when we need to. Beginning in step 12 and 13, we're going to set up the business identifier. And this is where, when you have a scheduled integration, you oftentimes don't have any values to start the integration other than the start time. So it's very common to simply grab that start time and leverage that as your primary business identifier. You can always create additional ones later on if you need to. So I'll click away, click Save to save the integration so far, and dismiss the banner, and we'll go ahead and hit the go back arrow so that we're ready to work on other tasks later down the road. All right, this concludes this practice. See you in the next video. All right, moving on to practice 10-3, we're going to implement some of the integration orchestration logic. There's just so much to do. We're kind of break these up into separate practices and even within them separate parts. So work with me. I'll every once in a while call out where I am in the series of steps. We're obviously going to start out by invoking on the FTP server to download and retrieve that journal entries file that we just looked at. So let me pull this out of the way, and we'll get started by opening up our integration, clicking on Edit. And right now, they're just prompting us to say, well, what do you want to invoke? Yeah, we want to invoke the FTP demo, so I choose it. We'll call it download file, which also happens to be the name of the operation we're going to use. Click Continue. Of course, we select the download file operation. We can leave the transfer mode as binary since we're not going to read any of the structure. We'll leave the input directory blank, the file name blank, because we're going to map that in dynamically, and we'll just put it into a VFS directory that we're going to call stage. Notice here that the perform unzip file, since it's going to be a zip file, needs to be done, so we're going to ask you to click it, and then that opens up this other one where, yes, we want to retain the zip directory structure, although in this particular example it wouldn't have mattered, but oftentimes that's a good practice. And then, of course, click on Continue, where we get to the summary page reviewing the instructions, and click Finish. And as always, once we configure and invoke, we now have a mapper that we can implement. Let's click the Save so far, and we're going to edit the mapper action to assign those values that we promised. One is the file name, and one is the directory. So let's go ahead and grab the FTP download directory. If you recall, that's the schedule parameter that we just created, and set it to a value, which is going to be potentially updatable, but we're going to leave it there. And that's going to be the directory, and the file to download is also a schedule parameter that we have available to us, and we'll put that to the file name. Click the Validate button, dismiss the banner, and click the Go Back arrow, and click Save to save our integration so far. All right, next, below the download file, we're going to implement another common pattern. Below the download file invoke, I should say, we're going to add a stage file action. So I hover right down here, click over here to Actions, and find that stage file action. We're going to call this List Files, which is also going to coincidentally correspond with the name of the operation that we'll be using. So select the list files operation, and it's asking now for the directory we're going to download from, where we'll list the files from. So if you just recall, we just set that. So let's go ahead and type in, /stage, which is the directory that we want. And technically, we know what file is going to be in there, but for our purposes, we'll just set the file pattern to be any files you find in that directory. Go ahead and list them all. We've checked this box just in case there are subdirectories involved once it's been unzipped. And now we click continue. So this will list all files when it gets called. Here's our summary, and we click finish. And with that first part done, we save the integration, and that takes it to the end of this practice. We'll pick up in the next video. All right, here in practice 10-4, we're going to implement some additional logic by setting up a for each loop. Within the for each loop, we're going to set up a switch that allows us to have a couple of branches depending upon the type of file that has been picked up within that loop. So all of that is going to be part of this implementation, and we'll actually add another action into the otherwise branch. So we're going to break this down into parts. Part 1, we'll start with adding the for each action and defining the repeating element. So I'll be working from those instructions. So we're going to be below the list file stage file action. For that location to add our for each. So under actions, we look for each. There he is, which will pop out this configuration pane. And as always with most actions, you want to give them some sort of meaningful name. So we've asked you to call this iterate over files, which is exactly what's happening here. And then we save that by clicking the apply checkbox. Now, for the repeating element, in order to define it, we need to click on this switch to developer mode, and then expand under sources. We're looking for the response from list files. So there's a list files, the response. And when I expand that far enough, what I'm looking for is to get down to the file list. So that's going to be a list of files. As you can see, if I expand it further, you have this ICS file node that is actually the array of file names that are being repeated. So this will be our repeating element. And then for to create a new data object, we need to give it a meaningful name. Now, this might work, but it'd be kind of confusing if you had lots of other files to process. In this case, just simply a more meaningful name like current file at least is more helpful. And then you'll notice that there's an option to process items in parallel. That's not always a good idea, depending on whether the order of files that need to be processed needs to be preserved. By not checking that, we're going to be processing and looping over these files sequentially. So now that that's all done, I simply click outside the box to set up and save all of that, and then click Save to save my integration so far and close that banner. All right, well, part 2 is to now add a switch action inside the loop, and we'll set up a criteria for the 2 different routes that we're going to dynamically go down depending upon the type of file. So let's do that next. We're inside the for each box where we want to now add our switch action. And it automatically pops up. See, here's the larger for each box expanded. Notice I can shrink it and I can expand it as I'm working with it. Likewise, my switch is a box that I can shrink but when I expand it, I can see the routes, and even routes can have one or more actions, obviously, and I can shrink a route anytime I want to, too. So whenever you're having real estate issues, it's important to remember what those little arrows are for. So for the route one, I'm sorry, for the switch here, containing the two routes here, what we want to do is go into the route one node and click edit for it to bring out the pane to name it and then to configure the condition for when we go down that route. So first we click on this edit pencil and we're going to call it or label it, I should say, CSV files, meaning that when it's a CSV type of file, we're going to take this path. So in order to enforce that condition, we set in the developer mode, I click here, and we're going to expand the current file element. There it is, the one we just picked up from the for each loop. And under that, we're expanding out to the ICS file properties of that file. And notice one of the properties the file has is a file type. So we take the file type and put that into the value. Then in the operator box, I'm saying, yeah, well, if that value is equal to, and in this case, we're going to compare it to its extension. If it's a CSV file, then that's going to make this true, if that makes sense. So we click outside the route, and that now updates this with the only warning telling us, well, there's no actions under the route yet. And of course, we know that. So click Save. And close the banner. Now to add another route, the way to do that is to come over here under the ellipsis, the ellipse to the side here, and click Add. Well, the mistake that some students will make sometimes is they try to click this button up here or this one down here. Remember, those are add icons. So this would mean add an action before the switch. This would be add an action after the switch, but within the for each. So it's easy to get confused. Just keep track of your scope. It's over here on the switch itself where we would add another route. And notice it just simply pops up here and immediately gives us opportunity to define it as well. So we're going to do something very, very similar. We're going to label this when for a property file. Technically, we're expecting really one file, so this would only ever happen once during any loop because there's only one property file associated with the one or more CSV files. So let's go ahead and define the condition. Just as before, we're going to use the same logic to go and expand our current file, expand the properties of the ICS file, and grab the file type. We say if that is, again, equal to, and this time the extension that we would be comparing to is properties. Obviously, a typo here would cause you some difficulties if you made a mistake with a typo. Now that that's defined, we click outside. And once again, we have route 2 labeled property file, but the warning saying there's no action. So let's save that as well. All right, we've gotten that far, and now if you're staying with me here, part 3 is we're going to work within that CSV files route 1 branch, and we're going to now bring the files into memory segments. Now this is under the theory that perhaps you had this big large file and it might be too large to bring in all at once. So to be on the safe side and even to have better performance, we're going ahead and break it up with a read file and segments option. So let's take a look at what this looks like. First of all, within the route, we add our first action, and this time it's going to be a stage file action. And yes, we're only going to call it read file, but this time we're not going to match that as the name of the operation. We're going to say, no, let's make this, instead of a read file, just a read entire file, let's read it in segments. As we learned about in our lecture, that has a different behavior. So under configure file reference, we leave it as no because we're going to specify the file name and directory. We could have said yes and just specify the file reference. In this case, we'll leave it as no. We're going to leave the segment size as 2000, which is the default. And now we need to specify the file name. So in order to do that, once again, we go to the designer view, expand current file, the ICS file, and then of course we now go find that file name right here under properties and bring it to the file name box. Okay. Next, we need to look at the directory to read it from, and so in this particular case, all we need to do is same location, grab the directory where that file is, and if we can read it from there directly. All right, we can leave all other fields the same. We want to make sure, again, in this case, for safety reasons and for just in case there's other issues with multiple records, we want to say we want to process things sequentially rather than in parallel. Notice that the when we did the for each loop, the parallel had to be chosen. In other words, the sequentially was the default. Here, parallel is the default, and sequence is something you had to select directly. Just an interesting observation. All right, click continue. And now we're forced to define, because you have to define the structure of the file. And you have all the options as usual. In this case, it is a CSV file, so we'll click continue. And now we're looking to grab from the resources folder that CSV file that we're pointing to. This is, in this case, is a general ledger sample, GL sample. A warning, if you have a very, very large CSV file, and if it's too large, you can't use it for this format definition. You would need to create a smaller version of it so that it's not trying to read too many files into memory. Now at this point, we need to name what each row will be called, or each record, if you will call. That's why it's not uncommon to just simply call it, it's a record in the file. And for the record set, we could call it anything, but since it is a general ledger, let's just label it that way, ledger. This is also, it's what's in the instructions. It's already set to comma delimited. We don't need to change it to anything else. The character set is okay at UTF, and we can also define, if we wanted to, other values that need to be optionally enclosed and terminated by end of line. So none of those need to change. The only thing we need to do is now let him know that these are not column headers. So let's pull that out. We don't have a first row that have column headers, and so instead it's going to create column headers name called C1, C2, C3. Now, if we knew what these were, like this is such and such a date, and this is such, so if we had more time, and we understood what all these various fields across here were actually called, we could rename these column headers to something more meaningful. We're going to skip that for now. Instead, we'll click on continue and review and click finish. And now that stage file has been implemented, and as a reminder, that's actually a scope, and so when you expand it is now where you can add actions inside of stage file. We'll save that for later. Let me save that. Close the banner, because the later is coming right now. Part 4, we're going to be within the read file and segments box, where we're going to be now creating a new file using a stage file action read file operation. So let's walk through that. So we click into here, and we want to add another stage file action. And in this case, we're going to call this write file. Again, it's not uncommon to name these almost identical to the name of the operation, although sometimes you want something more meaningful if necessary, like what kind of file am I writing. We'll change write file as our option, and as you can see, it's looking for the file name and also the directory. So the instructions tell us I need to click over here to open up our sources panel, and we go again to the current file that's in this loop at this time, expand ICS file and properties, and indeed that's the file name we're going to be creating. So this might be confusing to you. You're saying, well, wait a minute, isn't that the file we just read? Well, yes, it is. It's the file we just read. But what we're going to do is we're going to call the new file the exact same name that the file that we just read is. So that might confuse some. So we're just reusing that name so we don't have to give it another name. However, the directory is, again, the output directory. Where are we going to put this new file? And in this case, we're going to put it in the virtual file system at a location called processed. So, and we'll be staging other files there down the road. So now that that's been handled, we can click continue. And now it's time to define the structure of the file. So if you recall, this is the file that we want to change it to, and we have a schema for a native transformation, similar to what we did in Lab 9, but this time it's going to be, well, it's going to be a different native schema. So we choose schema. Notice there's not a choice for native schema. If it's a native schema, you just select schema and then continue. And now inside the drag and drop box, again from our resources folder, we've got the native schema for what needs to be transformed. Let me resort this alphabetically so I can find my general ledger. There it is. My general ledger native schema. Now, of course, if you want to look at that native schema file to explore it more on your own after you've completed the exercise, feel free to do that. But this will be the structure that it needs, and the only thing we have to do is select the schema element, which in this case is also general ledger. Click continue, proceed past the summary, and click finish. All right, click Save and close the banner. Now to see that action, you can expand out inside of here and see that the stage file, write file has been created, but then a new map action that has yet to be implemented needs to be configured. And that now takes us forward to step 5, where we want to work on that map action and essentially do the mapping of the data that it needs to get from the source to the target. So let's open up the map action with our edit. We're expanding under sources the read file response. That's the file that came into memory. And when I expand that all the way down through general ledger, and then each record within that general ledger, we see those generically named fields. Like I say, in the real world, we might have identified them more in a more meaningful way. And if you'll notice that the schema that we're going to map it to for a whole bunch of entries almost looks very similar. We, on purpose, kind of mixed it up a little bit just to make your mapping more interesting. So the instructions tell you to go ahead and take the C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. Map all those over. Map your C8 to C8, and then go down and map C91 to C91. We're just trying to save time. That's why we didn't want to actually do so many records. Then for currency, I'm going to show you how to do a different approach. Create target node, and then once you're in view-only mode in the expression box, if you click on the developer view, we can then provide a value. This is simply going to be a string indicating that it's US dollars. So that's what needs to go in that box. We click to save that, and now that's a text that identifies the type of currency. Then below that, we want to click on this upload time element, and we want to assign a function to that. You probably see what's coming. Under the functions here, we're going to expand from the components panel, we're going to expand the date category. And specifically, make sure you use the right one. It's the current date time function that we want, current date time. And I just simply drag that onto there. And now, since the current date time element doesn't necessarily require any arguments, it just simply returns an XSD date time, that kind of eliminates all we need to do. So let me close that. And according to the instructions, we should go ahead and just double check our mapping. So we'll change both of these, source and target, to mapped only. Apply that, and then we'll do a quick review. Looks like those have all been mapped, and their sources all come from the record as we expect. So it's a good way to validate your work. Click, speaking of validate, let's do that now. And we'll dismiss the banner, hit the go back arrow to get out of the map editor, and one more time expand that just to kind of see the mapping's been implemented, and click save to save our integration so far. All right, now we move ahead to the part 6, where we're implementing similar logic, but this time for the property file in root 2. But instead of doing a read file in segments, we're just going to do a straight read entire file this time, since it's never going to be a very large file. So I bring this out, and we go inside route 2, and we're going to click to add a stage file action. And I can't call it read file because we already have a read file action here. So to make it unique name, I have to call it read prop file. Click continue. And this time it will be indeed the read file operation. This time we'll select yes for the file reference, and we're going to bring that in, you guessed it, from a similar location. Once we click on that, we go to our current file. And the current file, when we expand this, shows that the file reference for that current file is visible for us right here. So we drag that into the box. There's nothing else to do like removing trailers or decrypting, so we click continue. And as always, we're forced to define the structure for this type of file. It happens to be associated with a CSV delimited type of file. So just because it's a .properties file extension doesn't mean it's not a delimited type of document. So we select that. And now in this case, the sample file that we want to load in is for instruction step 105, wants me to find the job details property file. There it is, which now reads that in. We have the opportunity to call that, I'll call each record a record, and the overall record set name, we'll just call it list. Again, all these others remain the same. The other thing we need to uncheck, because there's no headers in there, so instead we use the generic C1, C2 through 4 again. Again, if you had the names, more meaningful names for these headers, we could use them, but we'll just keep it simple for now. And click continue and finish. And now that's been added. There's nothing else to configure there, so let's click save and close the banner. Moving now to part 7, you're going to create essentially just a copy of the properties file and then staging it where it needs to go. And we'll also add a log action over into the otherwise branch in this part. So the next step is to go below the stage file, read prop file action, and that will add an action right beneath it. In this case, it's another stage file action, and you guessed it, we're going to write that file, but I can't call it write file. We've already used that, so write prop file will be a unique name. Switch to write file operation, where I now need to specify a file name to be created and where to place it. So the instructions say to click here and you guessed it, we're going to use the name of the file that came in. And since that's a good name, we'll just reuse that same file name. But then for the output directory, out of not just coincidence, but by design, we're going to use that same processed temporary stage directory that we're putting all the other files in. So if that makes sense to you, we go through the loop for each file, we do what we need to do, and we write a new file, either a new CSV or a new properties file, but we're going to put them all into this processed output directory. So we'll click on continue, and now we need to define its structure, which coincidentally, actually not coincidentally, it happens to be the very same type. So we just simply repeat what we just did because it's the very same structure. And this is kind of rare, but occasionally you don't have any transformations to make at all. While I could use different names, we're just going to use what we did before, record and list. We uncheck the first row. Again, it'll be identical, so you can kind of see what's about to happen. It's simply going to copy the values straight over. We'll click on Finish and click Save so far. So now we've read in the property file, and then we're going to write a property file that's exactly the same. It's going to be this mapper that we're going to use to configure the exact copy. So I'm looking for the read prop file. There it is, the read prop file response for the stage file. And when I expand that out and I expand the record, I can now see over here that that list has a record and the same exact elements are there. So in this rare, simple example, we're just doing a one-to-one mapping straight across. Now, in case you're curious, there actually is a faster way to do this that we don't have time to demonstrate now, where you can use a XSLT function to introspect through similar data objects, where you could do basically a copy action, has the effect of copy all. But since there's so few elements, it's actually faster to just kind of grab these across. If you had, 50 or 60 or 100, you might want to take advantage of that XSLT action or function. All right, so let's click validate. That's step 133. I know this is a big lab exercise practice. And then from there, with the banner, we can exit from the mapper, and then we can click save to save the integration. And we have one more thing to do, is add some logic in the otherwise branch to do just a bit of logging. So when I click inside of here, I'm at step 139. I want to go to select a logger action, which brings out the configuration pane. We'll give it a meaningful name. This is going to be log error message, because what we're saying is I didn't get either type of file. I'm expecting either a CSV or a properties file in that list. In this case, something is wrong. So that's the kind of message we want to log. If we click in here, I'm going to paste in, and I'm going to paste this in from the activity guide, but I'm aware that those quotes may need to be manually replaced. I think I'm coming from a Word doc, so I'm okay, but from a PDF, it's always a danger. So there's my logger message. Click outside. And we click save to save the integration so far. And the instructions now give us a little bit of screenshot of what ours should look like compared to what the solution should have looked like. And it looks like we're in pretty good shape. Actually, I would need to expand this to see it map up a little bit more nicely. And I can see that here, that it looks the same. All right, this completes this long practice. We will definitely see you in the next video. All right, with practice 10-5, we're going to pick up where we left off, completing the integration flow logic that will include invoking the ERP cloud. We'll also add a notification email action so we can see what's going on, and then also send a copy of the updated archive to the FTP server as well. So we'll combine that all. Again, I've broken these down into parts. And so let's start with part one, where we'll add a new stage file action to create a zip archive of the processed files. Let's close this or move this out of the way. And it says you want to do this underneath the for each action. Now this can get confusing. What does it mean underneath? Well, the only way to know that for sure is to essentially collapse the for each action. See that once you collapse it, all that stuff is inside of it. We want to go underneath. So a common mistake students sometimes will make is they'll go underneath and they'll scroll up here and say, well, that's underneath. No, that's within the for each action, not underneath it. Okay, so push it down like this, and then look for the add icon underneath there. All right, so now that all the files have been brought together, we're going to add a stage file action. And once again, our meaningful name will be pretty much what the operation is going to be doing. Zip files. Click continue. Choose the zip files action. And now we need to configure where and what. So first we need to create and define some sort of a file name. So we're going to actually do something interesting here under this first first specify the file name box. When we click on it, we're going to just simply provide the name of our file with our initials. Now again, I have this in our activity guide, but the warning here is not to copy and paste. I'm going to copy and paste because I know to replace the double quotes. But the other thing I got to replace is we want to call it journal entries.zip. So we're going to concatenate that together as a file name, but instead of using XX, we wanted to use unique initials. Now, since I've already done some other testing, I'm going to use JDM, and for safety, I'm going to go or 002. I don't want to have a duplicate file over there in the ERP cloud so that I run into a problem. So all you need to do is just make sure you have a unique prefix to journal entries.zip using the concat function. All right, that takes care of that. Now the directory to zip comes up. So when you click here on directory to zip, you don't necessarily have to use this because you can simply just type in, you know what the directory is. It's that same one that we've been using in the virtual file system, and that's the processed directory. There we go. So there's our process directory, and now we need a location to put that zip file. So again, we decided to call it final, as good as any other name. And just now we just have to remember, yeah, there's a final directory that's going to have all these. So when we click on continue, we have a summary page. Just to review that, we're going to call it unique name journal entries.zip, and it's going to be everything that's in the process directory that we have written to this point. So we click finish, and we click save to save our integration. And once again, under the for each action, we now have our zip file, which now when I expand this, looks like this. There it is way down here. That's why it's so easy to make a mistake if you're not careful. All right, let's move on to part two. We're now ready to add and configure that ERP connection as an invoke, and we'll basically launching this import journals bulk option using the zip files that we just created as an argument. So let's follow those instructions. Step 16, we want to go the line below zip files right here to add our next action. And under invokes this time, we're going to go to Oracle ERP. And the name for this endpoint, we're simply going to call it bulk upload to ERP. We'll leave the other fields alone, click continue, and we'll wait for it to give us a list of actions. Oh, that was quick. So yeah, notice there's 3 options. In this case, we're actually doing an import bulk load, which is a special kind of operation action with ERP Cloud. Click continue. And this will take just a little bit of time. It needs to load all the metadata in from this particular cloud server account instance. All right. Now that all the possible operations have been loaded, the bulk data import process has been loaded, I'm looking for the one that is for importing journals. So kind of the easiest thing to do is I could just start typing journals in here, and yeah, there it is. I found that bulk process. Now that I've selected that for the bulk process, I can just review and see all the fields that have been defined. We're going to leave everything as their default and click continue. Now, since we're not going to implement a callback with another integration for this lab, we won't check this box, but this is where you would check and then configure, indicate what is the other integration that will handle the callback. We're also going to accept the defaults here. Notice that you can define the notification mode to be just email or email and bell, so forth. Also, you can attempt to when the notifications are sent, only on failure or only on success or anytime. So we click continue. Takes us to our final summary page, which is fine, and click finish. And as always, let me quickly click save here. We have a new mapper that's going to be used to map what it needs as an argument. So that takes us, of course, to part 3, where we're going to be working with that new map action. Let's open it up for editing. So in the sources, if you recall that zip file response, right, that zip response, expand that out, zip response, and then ICS file, and then properties. Why? Because what we do over on the target side, under the import bulk data, and when we expand ICS file and properties for that, it has some similar fields. Now, we don't need to we don't necessarily need to map all of them, but for this exercise, let's just pretend that we want all the information for that file, all the metadata. So we're going to bring it over and map these one-to-one. All right, so our instructions kind of walked us through that. The other thing that we need to do is we need to provide from the zip response that file reference. So we grab that file reference and bring that across to here as well. All right, now that we have all that data, we can validate the mapping. Close the banner, exit out of the map editor, and we click save to save our integration so far. And now, and of course, there was I was able to double check my logic to make sure I had everything done with my screenshot. So we've now moved on to part 4. We're going to add an email notification action. Let's walk through those steps beginning in step 34. This will be below after we invoked to the ERP cloud. And we'll go to actions and add a notification action. And this will configure this email. We're going to name it send status email. And apply that save. Then for the to field, obviously we've already thought about this in advance. We already have an email address email to address that we're going to set up as a scheduled property. And then this time from the from field, instead of using our own address again, we'll just do a generic OIC admin at example.com address. Just make up one for our from field. Then for our subject field, we'll copy and paste in the value. I know the instruction says don't copy and paste, but the issue there again is those single quotes. So I'm just going to add the single quotes around what I paste in, so it won't run into a problem. And now we're going to build an interesting body. Before we can build the body statement, the lab instruction says we need to add some parameters. So right underneath here, we're going to create some parameters to populate this dynamic body of information. So the first one we're going to call file name. All right, and then for the parameter value, we're simply going to grab the file, the file to download, here it is, file to download value for that. We'll add another one, and we'll call this one directory. And again, for its parameter, we're going to grab that FTP download directory. So that can be populated for the email. That's two of them now. For the third one here, we're going to create a value called final archive parameter, final archive. And again, that's going to be the zip file response that we had within in our property. So if I click over here, zip files, zip response, ICS file, and then properties, that unique file name that you kind of came up with when you built it, that's going to be populated here in the file name where we can put it in there. And then we have one more parameter that we want to define, and that is something called a job ID. And what we're going to store in job ID is what we get back from that invoke that we just made, and that's the bulk, there we go, bulk upload to ERP. And that particular response, when I expand it, has this little number result. So we're going to put that as the parameter for the job ID. So with all of that done, we should be able to, let me pull up here to body. We should now be able to use any or all four of those parameters in our body. Now we provided something that you can copy and paste. Just don't use any surrounding quotation marks with this for your email message. So I'm pulling this from the activity guide. Successfully processed file name, that parameter, from the directory, that parameter, FTP directory, launched import journals process with the file name archive to Oracle ERP Cloud, and job ID is provided here with the result. So again, the lab instructions allow you to kind of compare your look. I just closed it, but that lets you know you kind of got it right. All right, so we're going to click on Save and move on to Part 5. In Part 5, we're going to configure a call to go to the FTP server so we can send a copy of what is going to the ERP cloud over to FTP server so we can look at it. So let me quickly save and follow our instructions accordingly. Now it looks like I made a mistake, which is wonderful because I was going so fast. Let me click to see what this is. Sure enough, it looks like I made a typo somewhere. And if this happens to you, you can kind of catch yourself. And if I look at the instructions, it says email's body contains reference to invalid parameters. So it looks like I called one of these the wrong thing. And I'm just double checking which one it would have been. I got a file name defined. I've got a directory defined. I've got a job ID defined. Oh, I misspelled final. Finale archive is not the name of the parameter, it's final archive. That's what happens when you go too fast with typing or copy and paste. All right, I'm glad I made that mistake so I can demonstrate how to fix mistakes. Notice the error went away. Although I didn't do that on purpose, but actually it was a good teaching moment. Let's now move on, part 5. Save my integration. We're going to configure the FTP demo connection. So we're hovering our cursor right below that last notification action. And we're going to, this time under invokes, look for the FTP demo. And we're going to call this endpoint send a copy to FTP because that's what we're doing. There we go. And click continue. So this advances to our configure operation, and in this particular case we're using a write file operation to send a file for the output directory. Just since you have to have something, we're just going to put TBD. Sometimes you just leave these things blank, and sometimes they're actually required. I've never had figured out why some are that way and some are not, but you just have to follow the requirements. Star.star. And then there's nothing else to do here because we're going to do the mapping for both of those values. So I click continue. And now we need to configure the schema. What's interesting on here is on the configure schema page, because it's FTP, it actually gives you the option to say, well, maybe we don't have to configure the schema. So we're going to select no because we don't need to create a file. We're just going to send a file that we already have, so we don't have to define the structure, which saves me a lot of time. Just use a binary transfer mode to write a file at some location that we're going to provide with our mapping, which we're about to do right now. So let me click on save, and a reminder, we're now up to part 6 where that new map action has been automatically added, and we're going to map the file name and the location where things are located. So let's go into the mapper, edit. Over here in Target, you got this outbound FTP header type. It's looking for a file name and directory. So over here on the FTP downloader, there it is. That's the directory we're writing to, right? And the file name is going to be the name of that zip file again. So we just did that earlier in another area, zip files response, expand that all the way out, down to the ICS file and down to the properties. And the name of the zip file we created is going to be available for us in that parameter. So we put that to the file name. And now we need to be able to in the target section, expand the data value here for ICS file. It's looking for a file reference. So sure enough, where's our reference? Well, if we go back over here to the zip file response, right underneath there is the file reference for that ICS file, which is now going to send that over. Again, as always, you want to double check your work against the screenshots to make sure you haven't made an error somewhere or mapped the wrong data value. So we click validate for that one. Close the banner, exit the map editor, and we'll save that integration. And believe it or not, we're actually done with implementation. So I can go back and see that my integration is configured. This ends this practice. We'll see you in the next one. Okay, we've reached practice 10-6, the last one in this lab, where we're finally able, now that we're implemented all our logic, to activate and do some testing and validating. So I'm going to be following the steps along the way for this import journal entries integration. We'll start with activating it. So we click activate. as we're used to doing now. And as always, we're going to select the debug level of tracing. Dismiss that banner, and again, the activation in progress can take a little while. If I refresh here too soon, it still shows in progress. So we'll click that a couple of times, but within 30 seconds, it should eventually become active. I'll refresh it again. And we're now in an active state, which is pretty important. So the next thing to do is do the run testing here. And when we click on run, again, it brings up the configure and run. This is a scheduled integration, which allows me to override the default values we have for each of these. Now, because we set these as defaults correctly earlier, because you did this from scratch, you should be good to go. This should be the journal entries.zip that you put into your, recall that you put into your FTP location. That's the name of the file. The location for that should be indeed your location that you've set up in your FTP server. And finally, this should be an email address that you have access to. If not, this is a good chance to fix it. Instead of having to go back and redefine them in the scheduled properties, on this run, you can actually make that happen right now. I don't have to make any changes since I got this one right. I click on run, and now we're ready to go. This one's going to take just a little bit of time, so we'll let it load in as a scheduled integration. And as before, I'm going to click on this instance ID so I can kind of monitor its progress. I can see that it got, well, in fact, I can see it already got through my for each loop and already made 2 iterations through that loop. There's a number 2. I can also see it got this far to the invoke. Let's see, getting ready to go to the invoke, hasn't got a response back from there yet, and it hasn't got back to these actions just yet. However, once I click a refresh, I can let it see if it's progressed any further. Let me see. Okay, good. Yes. Let me open that back up again. All right, wonderful. What we want to do is we want to kind of take a look at, see if everything completed like it should have. The first thing they're asking us to do is go in and check our email client to see if we got that notification message. I'm going to do that now and bring that over to you so you can see the email. Sure enough, successfully processed the name of the file. We put that one in dynamically. As we built the body, there's the directory that I'm using. There's the name of the new zip archive that I created to go to ERP Cloud, and there's a return job ID, which we'll be able to correlate a little bit later as well. Next thing it asks us to do here in step 12 is to go see over, did we actually get a copy of that new updated file? And then we can kind of look at it, comparing it to the old. Now, I'm not going to open both of these up, but well, first let's go ahead and see if I got mine. I will bring this in and refresh. There it is. So there's the new file. And so if I open this up, compare it to the original, it would look something similar to this, where the initial CSV file would have this. I'm sorry, the original CSV file had Europe and had this date, and we now have USD and have a current date into it. The last thing we want to do here is obviously go into the ERP Cloud application, logging in, and just basically take a look to see if it was the import job was successful. Now, it's a note here, we're not actually going to add new journal entries because it's the same file that everybody's using. They've already been added, but you should be able to see that it did reach the ERP Cloud. So let's go take a look by logging in, and I'm going to grab that URL. Again, it's the same URL that we were using earlier. As a reminder, that's right here. And we use the same credentials, the FAS credentials, to get to that. All right, now we are here in ERP Cloud. We can click on the navigator. We're looking for the Tools section. Again, I don't use these cloud applications that often. There we are, down there, Tools. And under there, we're looking for File, Import, and Export. Now, within the File field, I'm supposed to be kind of looking for my file to narrow my search, so I'm going to use the initials I use. I think I use JDM for that last one. I'm almost certain I did. Let's put a JDM star, see if that is what I had. Yes, it was plus a little bit more. So that's what we're hoping to find. And notice that process ID, that's the one that was returned to us in our email that we got from the response, that's 6807962. So there's that process ID of that file that was processed. All right, well, that kind of completes the round trip. If you want to spend a little extra time, exploring information, when you expand the for each loop, notice you can see what path it took on path. So it obviously processed the CSV file first, and then it processed the property file second. So when you're doing monitoring, you can use this for troubleshooting, or now digging into looking at the activity stream. If, like, for example, for each, you can see, yeah, here's all the stuff that happened in iteration 1. Here's all the stuff that happened in iteration 2. And you can well imagine if there had been a lot of files, how that might have been different. Or within that stage file, read file and segments, had there been a lot of segments. Clearly, notice there was only one segment, which tells us there were less than, what, 2,000 records, because we set up segment size of 2,000. All right, so let's wrap things up here, folks. This is a long lab, but we learned a lot, hopefully. We call it a workshop style lab because we went through a use case that was almost end to end. We didn't do the callback, but from scratch, we did the entire integration that gets that bulk job uploaded into ERP Cloud. That's it for this practice. Thanks for watching. Welcome to the overview for Lab 11, implementing error handling logic. Let's scrolling down and kind of take a look at the scope of this one. There are 7 lab practices that we've broken this down into. And if you look at it at a high-level perspective, the goal here is to take the lab integration that we did back in Lab 7, retrieve country information. We're going to make a new version out of it, and completely implementing a changed bit of logic. So one of the things we're going to do is, to simplify it first, is we're going to remove the ATP, the database invoke, and just let the client send in the country code. Now, you think this would be easier, and it is. From a client's perspective, he just sends in the code, the two-digit letter, and he will get back the country information from that same REST countries web service we had before. But what makes this way more interesting and far more involved is we're going to put several pieces of logic in here to provide for like a failover. So what if this country service is unavailable? Do we just send a fault back to the client or tell him he's out of luck? No, we're going to configure another service that provides some of the same country information. This is actually, both of these are both third-party free web services. So we're going to invoke this as a backup to send that information in case this first one fails. Now, in order to simulate all of that, we're going to put some simulated failure logic in for testing, and then set up some query parameters that the client can send in to help drive some of these tests along the way. So we'll be looking at scope and fault handlers within those scopes logic, as well as global fault handler logic to take care of logic along the way. The other thing I want to kind of point out to you, since there's a lot of activities going on, testing is a little bit hard to understand until you really read through this scenario. So I would encourage you to, if you're just watching me do it, obviously you'll see me do the test, but if you're going to be implementing these labs yourself, just pay attention to what the general scenario is supposed to be when it comes to testing. So we're essentially going to create a logic that the client could, when he makes a request, say, look, I only want information about the country if you can get all the information to me that I'm expecting in the response, all these different fields. If it fails, don't go to the alternate country. I don't want to back up a subset of data. I want all the data or nothing. So now, hardly any clients would really want that in the real world, but we're creating this use case so that we can kind of test logic in our conditional branching to decide, well, if it fails, do we go to the backup, or do we just go ahead and return him a response saying that it failed? So there's a lot of things going on here, including a little bit of discussion about how to use a JavaScript function. We've written a very simple one that you're going to import and you can take a look at, and we're going to use it for random logic to determine whether or not this primary country service should fail or succeed. We're going to set up a random generator to make it fail half the time and succeed half the time, which is kind of fun in this implementation. Finally, a bit of a prerequisite notion here. Again, Lab 1, of course, because you've set up projects, as well as earlier connection in Lab 7 to the external web service. So it's that part that is needed for from Lab 7, as well as the integration itself, since we're going, if I can go back up here, going from version 1 to version 2 of this. All right, that completes our overview. We'll see you in the next video. All right, starting here with practice 11-1, where, as I mentioned in the overview, we're going to take your retrieve country information version 1 integration and make a new version of it. While we're at it, we'll reconfigure that existing trigger to have a slightly different signature of data, and we'll go ahead and then update the existing business identifier, as well as adding a second tracking field associated with that query parameter that the client could be sending in. So we'll get started here with task 1 from our projects page. We're going to open up project again. And now the integrations, we're looking for that retrieve country information. Now, depending on what kind of work you have done, you may have trouble not seeing it right in the front. Remember, you can always look at all your integrations by expanding that out, then going back and finding the one you're looking for. I'm going to go ahead, go to this one here, and we're going to go over here to create new version. So notice that the name remains the same when you're creating a new version. You just have to decide if it's going to be a major or minor version upgrade. In this case, we're going to make it a major version, change that to 2 and change that back to 0, and click Create Version. And dismiss the banner. And now we're ready to go in and do some editing, so I can either click directly on it. By the way, if I want to shrink that back now that it's going to be up at the top, since I'm working on it, I can do that. And we can click to edit. First thing we need to do is update our trigger. So we click in here and edit. The basic info would remain the same, although in the real world we would probably add some sort of additional description as to what's different in this version. We'll skip that for now. We're going to now change slightly the name of the template parameter. Since we're going to be asking for the country code, we're going to change that to code for this version, because that's all we need from the client. Click there, leave the other fields as is, and click continue. And now if you'll notice back on this field here, we have the code now is coming in as a string. We can leave that, but the lab instructions say we need to add a couple of, we need to add a query parameter. Of course, as a reminder, query parameters are optional for the client. Template parameters are required. Although sometimes a query parameter, even though it's technically optional, may be absolutely required for the service to work correctly. All right, so we add this one, and we're going to call this under the name option, we're going to call it option. And this is a string data type. And now we're ready to move on and configure the response. In this case, since our response format isn't going to change, we're essentially going to, let me click here, we're going to return the same bit of data back to the client in most cases. We really don't have anything else to do here, so we can simply click continue. Review our endpoint summary. The only thing that's really changed is we've changed the template parameter from ID to code, and we've added an optional query parameter called option. Click on finish. And you'll notice now that immediately a little warning message comes up with a mapping expression. We'll deal with that in just a moment. For now, we need to deal with our business identifier, because when I open him up, the idea of an ID is no longer viable. So we need to get rid of that. Let me click here and eliminate that value by clicking delete. And then from our template parameter coming in, we're going to bring that code in. But let's rename that to be more meaningful. That's country code. All right. Now the lab instruction says we want to do a second tracking field, so it'll be easier to see when we're doing monitoring. Under query parameters, we're going to get that option in here. And we will rename that response option. Good. We'll click away. Saves it. Click on Save to save the integration. And then we can click the Go Back arrow to go back to our project page. And that completes this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, now here in practice 11.2, since we're going to have a backup service to retrieve country information, we need to have a REST adapter connection to that service. So that's what we're going to do here in practice 11.2. Follow along with me as I start with task 1. We'll go into the connections pane, clicking the plus icon. We're searching for REST again to find our REST adapter, and we're going to call this connection alternate country service. Let me paste that in. This will be in the invoke role only, and we click create. As we had with the other one, this is going to be a REST API based URL, and we provided the connection URL for you in the lab activity guide instructions. There it is right here, apiworldbank.org. And for security policy, just like the other one, there is none. So we say none and click test. It confirms the URL as well as letting us know that it's accepting the configuration. We just saved it, got the confirmation banner. I can now click the go back arrow, and we can see that our alternate country service is configured. We'll see you in the next video. Here in practice 11.3, we're going to be now changing some of the integration logic. The first thing we'll do is delete the invoke to the database since we no longer need it. And then we're going to add a scope action and move how to move the actions we already created back into that new scope container, and then update some of the mapping for the get country info invoke since the country code is no longer being used. Let's get started. We start with opening up in the Task 1 Integrations panel, and we're going to click on Edit. And we're looking for this get code invoke to the database, ATP. We no longer need it. Let's see why I wasn't worried about that mapper being wrong. We just don't need any of this. So notice that when I delete this, let me click delete, the mapper associated with it also goes away. Pretty straightforward. Easy enough. Now let's add a scope action, and we'll move these actions into that. So to do that, let me first click Save. And so just below the trigger, right here, we're going to click on Actions and use the scope action. And our instructions say, let's give it a meaningful name, which we will. We'll call it Process Request, which is essentially what we're doing within this scope. But the main reason we're using the scope is so we can implement some fault handling logic. Click away from that. Again, clicking Save and close the banner. Notice that the little warning also tells you that you don't yet have any actions implemented in here. So now what I need to do is move these two actions into the scope. The instructions here beginning in step 10 explain how to do that. So I click on this icon here, and then I'm going to drag my cursor around the three elements. Actually, I said two. I need to drag around all three of these. And once I've done that, the box looks like it goes away, but that's okay. When I click here on Cut, it identifies the three that I've selected. And now when I click here on adding an action, rather than choosing an action to add, notice there's a new little paste that pops up in here. So I click on Paste, and now they're moved into here, which is pretty handy for those use cases when you created maybe a prototype, but you didn't implement any error handling logic, but now you want to, and so you know you need a scope so that you can later add a fault handler, and that's what we're going to be doing here in just a moment. So the next thing we want to do now that these are in the right location is first click Save. And now we see that we have an issue. Of course, now we can address it right here with this one, that the mapping is not quite right. So when I click here on Edit, this is step 16 if you're following along, to open up the Map Editor. We're now going to go and take a look. Of course, it already says that the mapping is not valid. That's because if we expand over here the template, this little code guy is not appropriate done. So we, because it's now invalid. When I click on that, it just doesn't know what to think of that because we got rid of the database. So I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to click on Delete Mapping. That opens it up for me to now to map the code elsewhere. In our case, we're going to be pulling in from the template parameter the code directly over here, and that confirms it. We click on Validate, and I can dismiss the banner. Click the Go Back arrow to get arrow, I should say, to get out of the mapper, and now we can click Save to save our integration so far, which wraps up this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, next here in practice 11.4, we're going to actually now implement some error handling logic by implementing the default scope fault handler that we just added a moment ago. Within there, we'll have a switch action that has two different routes based upon what the client has indicated, whether they want a complete response from the primary service or nothing at all, or we can put in logic for them to simply now go to the backup service where we'll make a call over there to that alternate country. So a lot of steps involved here. I'm going to start with obviously number one. We want to hover our cursor over this scope, and in this ellipse icon, expand out the fault handlers, and we'll see there's actually two of them. The one we want to implement is the default handler. And what it opens up now next to the main flow is this purple looking fault handler box that I can expand and add one or more actions inside of here. So within this box, the first action I want to add, looking at number 2, I guess, 2 and 3, is we're going to add the switch action, which will set up a couple of branches for us. By default, we want to do something with the logic of Route 1. So when we click on this element banner, we can click on the Edit to open the Configure Route pane. And as always, it's kind of nice to give it a meaningful name. In this case, I'm going to call it No Backup, meaning we're not going to call the backup service because the client has indicated he doesn't want us to go to the backup service for our testing purposes. All right, so with that said, we need to create a condition value for that. So when I click in here for the first value box, I'm going to be looking at that option parameter, and if he has provided it, number one, and it happens to be equal to the value of complete. So if that's what he's indicated, I only want a complete response, then that means we're going to go down this path because he only wants a complete response. We're not going to call the backup service. All right, so with that done, I can click outside the box. We click Save. Now, inside this Route 1, since he doesn't want since he doesn't want any kind of call to a backup service, we want to launch the inline menu, and we're just going to go ahead and locate the return. We're going to send him a return action. There he is at the bottom. And so there's nothing to configure in the return. What needs to be configured is this automatic map action that automatically recognizes I need to return the response. And when we open this up in the editor, we can see the layout of that response. That's the country information. Now, we're not going to be able to give them that information, and we could have returned default, but in this case he said he only wants a full response. So instead of creating a fault for this demonstration purpose, we're going to map some data for this native name target node. So we turn it into a target node by clicking there, and then click on the developer view to paste in some text. And what I'm going to do here is paste in this text that we have in the activity guide, and we'll read it for a second. Primary service unavailable. Backup service was not called based on your request for full or complete information only. And I got to fix these double quotes because of my copy pasting. That should work correctly. I'll click on Save, and that'll be okay. I know you're getting all these warnings in the activity guide about not copying and pasting. Just pay attention to those. Otherwise, you're going to have to troubleshoot later on. Now we see the text element next to the native name. That means there's no other information. The only thing they're going to see is this sort of message. Click on Validate. And we now have our confirmation message that was successful. Sometimes that can take longer. I had to kind of fast forward the video waiting for that validation to complete. So we're closing the banner. We'll exit the map editor by hitting the back arrow, and we'll click Save once again to save our integration so far. I'm now moving down to step 25, where we want to implement logic in the otherwise branch. And so when we think about this, in this case, we want to now call that primary service instead of just returning that message. We're going to, if they didn't indicate complete and the primary service failed, which is we're going to simulate later on to show you how that's done, then indeed we're going to be able to call this backup service. So we click inside of here, and under invokes, we're looking for that alternate country service that we're going to now configure. In this case, we're going to call the endpoint get backup info. And the URI, the relative resource UI for this particular service, again, it's a real external service that we're adding to, is v2 country/code, which is a template parameter. We've selected get, and now we need to configure this endpoint to receive a response. I'll click continue. This particular web service requires a query parameter. In this case, we're going to add that since it's required under this value, we simply put format, which is required, and that format is a string data type. We'll click below, and our code is also a string, so we can click continue. Now on this configured response page, the response will be a JSON object, and we've made it a little bit easier for you to handle the JSON object by copying it in from the resources the resources folder that you have already unzipped. In this case, we're looking for the alternate country API response. There it is. And again, for those that are curious, if you click inline, you can see the data that guy sends back. Not quite as much data as what we would get from the primary service. All right, so I can click continue, which takes me to my endpoint summary. It all looks good. It has a code for a template parameter and a optional format query parameter that actually is required by the external service. Click on finish. And let's save our integration again. And as always, a map element has been added for us to, a map action has been added for us to configure. So let's go straight to it. Under sources, we expand our template parameters. Under their template parameters, there's that code. So as you might have guessed, the instructions tell us to map code to code. But then under query parameters, we have this format parameter. So I make that a target node so I can map something to it, switch to the expression editor, and here we need to indicate that indeed we want the JSON response and not XML. All right, we save that. We see the text icon next to that, and click validate. Dismiss the banner, and I can now exit the map editor. And once again, save my integration so far. All right, so the last implementation step in this route at step 53 is after we've made that invoke, is we want to add a return action. So just below the invoke, right there next to them, is we go to our actions and we're looking for that return again. And this time, as you would imagine, now the mapper allows us to define what should be returned back to the client in this case. And as you might have guessed, we're going to take as much information from that backup service as we can. So now that we have that, the response from the backup service is here. I'll expand that all the way to include top level array. And under that I have, let's see, top level array, then nested array, and then nested array item. That's the layout of the response. Alrighty. So not all the information that's required from that the primary service can provide is provided, but we can provide some of it. For example, we got the name of the country. All right, and for the IS2 code gives us the Alpha 2 code. The ID is actually the Alpha 3 code, and the capital city can be provided for the capital, but we don't have data for the population or the area or the native name. However, what we can do is inform the client that the reason why they didn't get the population in the area or the native name is data I can put in here as a comment. So we make this a create target node again. And once again, I'm going to paste in what we provided as a recommended. Let's click on developer mode here. Paste this in, adding the double quotes on either side of that. Essentially, we're saying, hey, the results you see above are from the backup service. Limited country data is available, and that just kind of gives us a notion when we're doing testing that that's where it came from. Alrighty, once again, we save that. And of course, we need to verify our mappings. You can always do that by clicking in the filter, go to map values on both sides, and then you can just double check that from the screenshot of the activity guide that you've chosen the appropriate elements, and it looks like we did a good job with that. Alrighty, click the validate button, close the banner, close the map editor, and click save to save our integration so far. That's it for this practice. We'll see you in the next video. Okay, now here in practice 11-5, we're going to implement some logic in the global fault handler. Essentially, this is a great comment here. While we could allow just the runtime fault that was thrown by the external service to just pop right up to the global fault handler and send that back to the client, instead of just doing that via the error hospital, a nice best practice is to create a custom fault message so we can look at it and take a look at that information for maybe additional troubleshooting information. So we're going to follow along and implement that. Watch carefully as I start here with step 1, where we're going to view the global fault handler. I'm on the main page here, but notice this icon here says click to view global fault handler. And once I do, I can see the default implementation. By the way, you click back onto here to get back to the main integration. So this is sort of like a toggle between the two design canvases. And as we talked about in the lecture, the default behavior is it simply catches any fault that hasn't been caught and then simply rethrows it to the error hospital, which then, of course, sends it back to the client. Easy enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to, just above this rethrow fault, we're going to create a new custom fault by selecting the throw new fault action. And then we'll give it a meaningful name. Our lab instructions tell us to call it custom fault. Okay. It's a good enough name. Let's spell it correctly. And now we're ready to provide some information. So the only one that we have to implement, if you'll notice over here, the only one with an asterisk next to it is code. So you got to have some sort of a code. What we'll do is we'll simply take the code that was returned from the global fault. There's that global fault object that's only visible here in this particular global fault handler. And when I expand that, I can take the error code that has been thrown and I can capture that in this custom fault. Then just for our purposes, we want to click the details field and essentially type in some data inside this little box so that we can use that for troubleshooting later. Again, I'm going to avoid copying and pasting the single quotes. Instead, I'm going to just paste in the data and then put single quotes around it. yeah, I can do it once I click here. There we go. And I can click away from that to capture that information. Easy enough. Let's click outside of here to capture that data. And it's implemented. And we click Save to save the main configuration. So let me close this right now and then go back to the main page. And our lab exercise activity guide asks us to kind of review where we are at this point. And so I can kind of review that I've got things configured correctly, which is nice. But then below that, it talks about the fact that really this is all you would need to do. You've handled catching the request, going to the primary service. If the primary service fails, in other words, if this at runtime fails from the main path inside the scope, the rule is to now throw it to the fault handler. He's now going to catch it, and if the client didn't specify a complete option, it's going to go into the otherwise branch, call this backup service, and when it calls that service, it's going to provide that response back to the client. However, if the client said, I only want complete results, and if this service fails, then indeed it's going to go into this route 1 where we reply to them saying, well, we didn't call the backup service, you get nothing because that's all you wanted. Now, the reason we implemented the global fault handler is something you'll see a little bit later on, and that is, well, what if the primary service failed and the backup service failed? Who's going to catch that fault? Well, we got a global fault handler now that's going to catch that fault and provide us some troubleshooting information before that fault goes back to the client. All right, that concludes this practice. We'll see you in the next video. All right, we reached practice 11-6, and this is where now we're going to implement some logic so that we can handle some simulated failure use cases within our integration and just essentially get used to learning about some new things. In part 1, we're going to allow the test client to force a failure by looking at the query parameter for the option to say that, yeah, he wants the backup service to fail. So that's really all fail means. You know, if you do go to the backup service, make that fail also. And then in part 2, what we're going to do is create a condition to where the primary service will actually fail because we're sort of going to not call it, right? We're going to set up a JavaScript function call. We'll show you how to add one of those and then use this random function, and we'll test for that so that our throw fault action will actually throw a fault after the invoke action to the primary service, depending upon the value of that. So it's a lot to kind of think about. You might want to review this later after you've seen the implementation. So we'll break these into 2 parts. Part 1, we're going to check to see if the test client wants to have the backup service fail. All right, step 1 is we go into the scope's default fault handler. Here we are again in there inside. And within there, we're going to go over that switch element and add another route. So here we go. We click to add another route. And as always, it immediately kind of pops up the configure route pane. We want to give it a meaningful name. And this will be the fail check. So if the client didn't say complete for the option, which is what we're checking for here, then maybe he said fail, or maybe not. So in that case, we'll go down this path. And what we'll do now is provide a check that we did, same as we did before, against that query parameter. So we take the query parameter of option, and if that is equal to the value of fail, I'll type that in. So if that's equal to fail, we want to take this path. Otherwise, we'll actually try to call the backup service. So essentially what we're doing is we're circumventing the fact that, and we're pretending, because he said fail, that instead of calling the backup service, we're essentially pretending that it failed, and that will get our simulation working. All right, with that done, we're going to save the integration to this point and dismiss the banner. Now it's time to implement some logic, and it's going to be pretty straightforward. Inside this route to fail checkbox, we're going to add a throw new fault action. Now, quick review, if I throw a new fault from here, where does that fault go? And you guessed it, it's going to go up beyond the scope, up beyond the main flow, up to the global fault handler. All right, let's click on Edit. For the name, we're going to call it backup fault, basically saying the backup service pretending that it's failed. Click the apply. And here we're going to provide 503 for an error code in the code area. In the reason box, we're going to type in this string message. Again, I'm just going to paste it without the single quotes and then add those here. Good. Then that's really all we need for now, because we don't need to pull details. But what we do need to do is ensure that it always occurs by not configuring a skip condition. So in this case, remember, it's throw new fault, when we talked about in the lecture, can either be a conditional throw, like we're going to do in a moment, we'll do that a little later, or it can be an always throw. So by not configuring a skip condition, it's an always throw. So we click outside of here and click Save to save the integration. And now I can click the go back error to return to the project design page if I need to, just to ensure everything is in a good state. Now, we're ready to move to part 2, so I'm just going to move straight ahead into part 2. We want to add this throw new fault action, but before we do that, we need to have a new JavaScript function. So this is where we're setting you up to learn how to add one of those libraries. In this case, it's really pretty straightforward. Step 21 says we go to the Libraries pane, click Add, and we drag and drop a zip file that contains library jars, or a jar file, or a JavaScript file. Well, in this case, we happen to have a JavaScript file in your resources folder, and if you're interested in what it looks like, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and show you that right now so you can have a feel of what that looks like. It's a simple little function. I'm going to open it up, and it's very small. It's a generate random function. Basically, using the generate random function is simply going to do a math random call times 100. In other words, and then we use a mod function on it. In other words, it's either going to return based upon the number, odd or even, 0 or 1. So depending on the number that gets generated, what you're going to get back is a 0 or a 1 based upon this random number generator. Okay, makes sense? Got a random number. Random numbers are either even or odd, so that's 50-50. So the mod 2 would return that for us. All right, so that's what is in this file. Let's click Open. And at this point, then all we need to do is leave all the fields it is and import that JavaScript library. Dismiss this. And then on the left side of the page, notice here we want to configure and select the function. Now this obviously only has one function, so yeah, we want that generate random function. And the result that gets returned is actually not a string, it's going to be a number. So let's indicate the output is a number. And unlike most functions that have some sort of input parameters, this has none. It's just something that will be executed at the right time. So we'll see how easy it is to use that. So we click Save, and then we click the back arrow to exit that function configuration. All right. Now that that's done, let's call that function. Let's go to our integrations panel again and open it up for editing. This is step 29. Step 30 says we want to hover our cursor on the line below the get info trigger. Again, there's a lot in this integration, but if I squeeze up the scope, I can see the next thing below the trigger before I get to the scope would be only right here. So it can get confusing if the whole thing is opened up and you're tempted to try to come in here or try to come in here. Yeah, just be careful with that. So I'm going to hover below here to click on Add, go to Actions, and this time we're looking for the JavaScript call. It pops out, and now I need to select a function. Now before I do, we're going to give this another meaningful name. We're going to call it call random. Let's check my typing here. There we go. All right, call random is saved, and this is so easy. It's going to introspect a list of all your functions that you have available. Of course, you only have one because we only brought one in. So I select it, and because there's no input parameters for this one, there's nothing for me to configure to map into it. So it's very easy. I simply click to save it and save the integration, which is pretty simple. So now we have a number that has been created. The next thing we need to do is we need to save the value of that into what's called a global variable. Now, if you recall, global variables are available throughout the integration. We certainly don't want to leverage inside the scope a local variable because it would be out of scope. So to create a global variable, we're going to come back over here to this icon. This is step 38. And you don't have any global variables, but we will here in a moment. We're going to call it test error. And we're going to change the type to a number. And close that. Save our integration. And now I'm moving down to step 45. And right below, essentially above the scope, but below this call, we're going to do an assignment using a data stitch action. So under actions, I go to data stitch, and we need to set the value of this global variable. So we click here next to the variable box. There's our test error global variable. So say we'll take that a variable and assign to it some value. What's the value do we want? Well, the lab instruction says if you check the call random, there's going to be a result from that call random, and we're going to assign this variable the result of that call. Again, we know it's going to end up being 0 or 1. Excellent. So we save that. And so finally, moving down to step 55, we're going to add a new throw new fault action inside the scope on the main flow. So let's open it up just prior, or I'm sorry, inside the main flow, just above the get info map element. All right. So we invoke the service. Now the service probably isn't going to fail on its own and throw a fault, but what we're going to do is pretend that the service maybe failed or maybe didn't. So how this is going to work is we, right above this get info map element, instead of returning a response, we click here to add a throw new fault. But this is going to be a conditional throw new fault, and we'll see how to configure that condition. First thing, we give it a name, primary fault. Probably a better name would be conditional primary fault, but it's good enough. Again, we're going to enter 503 for the error code. And for the reason, we'll paste in this little string value that we came up with. click here so I can put those quotes around it. There we go. And I don't need anything for the details, but I do need to configure the skip condition. So we click to add a skip condition, and now we're going to do a test. So we click here on Developer View, and we drag that test error. That variable now has a value up above, since before we got into the scope of either 0 or 1. And we're basically going to say if that is equal to 0, I'll just type that in. So if the field is 0, then we're going to skip this and go ahead and turn the response. So if it's 0, that means it didn't fail, and we're going to respond back. But if it's not 0, that means we're going to pretend it did fail. We're going to throw this fault, and where's that fault going to be caught? Yeah, you guessed it. It's going to be caught not in the global fault handler, but in our fault handler, where now we go to test to see if they wanted a complete option. If so, we tell them that the primary service failed, we're done. Or they didn't say anything. In that case, if they didn't say anything at all, then it goes to the otherwise branch and we give them the backup service. But if they said fail, go ahead and fail the primary service, then that's going to get thrown into the global fault handler. So if you're not confused yet, hopefully this will help you once this will help a lot more when you actually do it yourself or watch me do the testing, which we'll do here in just a second. Let me save our work, and we will return back to the project design page, completing this practice, and we'll see you in the next video.